Storyteller who was the executive responsible for movies like Secrets and Lies, The Last Seduction, Breaking the Waves, The Celebration, The Apostle, one of the great leaders of this industry, Bingham Ray.
In the summer of 1987, in July, I was working in Los Angeles, living in Los Angeles with my wife and my newborn son. And I was working at the Samuel Goldwyn Company, and I was the vice president of marketing and distribution. Now, I'd been working in the film business since the very early 80s, and almost exclusively in independent films and foreign language films. And I'd been working at Goldwyn since 1985. I worked for a man, my boss was Samuel Goldwyn Jr. He was the son of Samuel Goldwyn. And Samuel Goldwyn more or less invented the movie business. And Sam was a really, really nice guy. He was really nice to me, but he was a little more comfortable with defeat than victory, and a little more passive than aggressive. And I was bored, and I was restless, and I wanted to move on. So I quietly and discreetly started calling around, looking for another gig. And I got a call from Tom Rothman, a former New Yorker who had come to Los Angeles to work at Columbia Pictures under David Putnam. David Putnam was a British producer, is a British producer. He'd made Midnight Express, Chariots of Fire, Local Hero, my particular favorite, and he was running Columbia Pictures, and his mandate was to more or less reinvent the studio and change the movie business. And Tommy called me and said, how happy are you with Goldwyn? And I tried to be really cool, but I more or less said, get me out of here. So a meeting was arranged, and in those days we had one car, and we had gotten a little motor scooter, which I swear to God had a hairdryer for an engine. And we lived in Venice, and Columbia was in Burbank in those days, and so it took about 3 days to get there from Venice. And so for the interview, I go through the gates, and I'd never been to that studio before, and it's a magical, unbelievably beautiful experience to get into a studio, to walk the back lots, to look at the streets, and it's 1938, and you can see Jimmy Cagney sitting there. It's amazing, it's great. And so they usher me into David's office, and there's 3 assistants, and the phones are going crazy, and it's just nuts there. And they say, would you like anything? And I said, a glass of water would be nice. And so they gave me a glass of water, and they ushered me into David's office, and it was this vast, incredibly well-appointed, beautiful thing where it had white, deep plush sofas, and a hardwood floor, and flora and fauna, and there's David Putnam. And David Putnam was an elegant man, elegantly dressed, but casually. And he had a lovely gray beard, and his teeth weren't so hot, but he was really happy to see me, and he didn't know me. And so he said, sit, let's talk. And also there was a great man who worked with David named David Picker, who is a legend in his own right, and he was David's number 2. So there were 2 Davids, David Putnam and David Picker. We had a meeting, which was really a conversation. They said things like, so Bingham, do you like movies? And I said, it's like, I know a no-brainer when I see one, so I say, yeah. And they say, look, we're trying to do different things here. This isn't like the normal studio. We're trying to do things that just, the studios can't do and haven't done, and that's what we're doing. Are you interested in things like that? And I said, I'm trying to be cool. I go, yeah. And they go, so listen, if you're interested in this kind of opportunity, we'd like you here, and it would be great. So we can try to work it out, right? And I said, yeah, I think we can try to work it out. So I got this job. Now this job was amazing because there are a lot of people who do this kind of work really well, and they all wanted this job. and I got it. So it was like the job to get. It was amazing. I couldn't believe it. I go home, and I tell my wife, and she's really pleased, and our little baby, she's sitting there, and I call my mother, and I said, Mom, I just got this job. I'm going to be working at Columbia Pictures with David Putnam. It's amazing. And she goes, you changed jobs again? And then I said, it's Columbia Pictures, Mom, it's Columbia Pictures. And she goes, oh yeah. That's the company with the Statue of Liberty, right? The one holding the torch. And I said, yeah, the Statue of Liberty Company, that's right, Mom. Yeah, she's not a movie person. So now this is in late August, and I gave notice at the Goldwyn Company, but for reasons, because they needed a replacement for me, and it took a bit of time, I didn't get to start at Columbia until the second to last week in September. So now, Sunday night, before my Monday start date, I can't tell you how excited I was, how nervous I was. I essentially, I left for work at 2:30 in the morning. Now keep in mind, the hairdryer going over the hill, it's a little tough. So I leave for work at 2:30, and my wife thought that was really, normal and acceptable. But I get to the studio gate, and I'd been there a couple of times to lay out the office and stuff, and I get there, and the guard at the gate says to me, you have an appointment? I said, no, I'm starting today. This is my first day. I'm the Vice President of Special Projects. And he said, what's your name? I go, Bingham Ray. Looks at the list, and he goes, I don't think so. And I said, really, no, I'm starting today. My name's Bingham Ray. And he goes, you might want to call somebody. I said, you might want to try Bingham, because a lot of people, they kind of switch my names around. And so he looks at the list, and sure enough, he goes, welcome, Mr. Bingham. So this was Monday. Now, essentially my job that week was to get familiar with all the films that I'm going to be working on. Now, the films that we had, that David Putnam had laid in there for a guy like me to work on, were amazing. It was The Last Emperor by Bernardo Bertolucci, and Hope and Glory by John Borman, and Housekeeping by Bill Forsyth, and School Days by Spike Lee, and White Mischief by Michael Radford. I mean, we're talking some amazing movies here. And when I was walking through the halls on that Monday, my first day, it was like a utopian society. There were people who were just so happy to be there. Men and women and all shapes and colors and sizes, all happy and really working hard, and it was just incredible. And I spent that first week just watching those movies. I mean, they're paying me to do that. It's insane. So on the Friday, I'm coming to work on the hairdryer. Everything's great. I get to the gate, and the guy in the gate, he looks a little perturbed. And I said, how you doing? He goes, hello, Mr. Bingham. And so I get into the office, and I walk in the door, and everyone is sobbing. I mean, everyone is just beside themselves with an emotional state. I thought, maybe someone had killed like 40 people, because it was just like that. And I said to someone, just anybody, I said, well, what's going on? And they said, David got fired. I said, David got fired? He goes, and David's out. David's gone. And I said, this is my first week. This is the Friday of my first week. So I go to my office, and I had picked up an assistant, and out of the assistant pool, and I said, let's try to get David Putnam on the phone. And she goes, he's gone. And so I called David Picker, and I talked to David, and he sounded perfectly cool. He said, come on in, let's talk. Everything's cool. Everything will stay the same. You're just going to do your thing. We're going to get these films out. We're going to show these guys. It's going to be great. And I said, man, but David just got fired. He goes, everything is cool. Everything is cool. So I really believe that. I got home that day and I said to my wife, David Putnam got fired on the first Friday of my first week. And she goes, that's not good. And it wasn't good, but for weeks and weeks, I'm operating in this vacuum where I was working on all these amazing films and getting them ready for release, and I loved it, and even though I was looking around, and I know I was clueless. I knew then I was clueless, and I know today that I was even more clueless. I thought it was still great, because I had the films to back me up. These studio people must really love these films. So we finally, we're getting these things in shape and getting ready to go. And my assistant comes by and says, Jim Spitz would like to have lunch with you. And I said, James Spitz, he's the head of distribution. Now, you gotta understand about James Spitz. James, known as Jimmy. Now, when I was there, I was, in my really early 30s, and Jimmy was probably in his mid to late 40s, but I thought he was like 107. And he just was the epitome of that old dinosaur hard driving, I'm going to rule by fear and intimidation kind of distributor, which you really need, you know, when you have to get 1 million runs for stuff like Leonard Part 4, which was what his forte was. So we go to lunch. Now, I have to tell you that a friend of mine who has a lot of experience, a lot more than me, said, look, if you ever run into Jimmy Spitz, do one thing. Don't tell him anything about yourself, because he will use it against you in a very malicious way. And I thought he was kidding. So we go to lunch. And, you know, we drive over the hill, fortunately not on the hairdryer, and we go to the Palm, you know, in Los Angeles, this big steak place where the steaks are as big as this place. And Jimmy sits there and he goes, so, Brigham, where are you from? And now, that was like the first, how are you thing, and I was going like, well, I gotta lie, you know? I couldn't lie. I had to tell him where I'm from. He goes, hey, are you married? I said, yeah, I'm married. Yeah, we just actually, you know, yeah, I'm married. And he said, what's your wife's name? I said, it's Nancy. He goes, oh yeah, where's Nancy from? I said, Oklahoma. And he said, really? Is she an Indian? And I said, as a matter of fact, yeah, she's a Native American. She's a Creek. And he said, he looked, and his eyes just wide open, and he goes, you know what that makes you, right? And I said, her husband? And he said, no, that makes you Squaw Man. So for about 2.5, 3 weeks, I was Squaw Man. If I saw him in the hall, I was Squaw Man. If we were in a meeting, I was Squaw Man. I was just Squaw Man. And so finally, I go into his office and I say, you know, Jimmy, you gotta lay off the Squaw Man stuff. And he goes, yeah, you know. I said, you know, because it's really demeaning to my wife's family and to Native Americans all over. And he goes, okay, Brigham. You're an art guy. Hi, I'm an art guy. That's better than Squaw Man any day. All right, so, you know, this is really increasingly difficult at this point because I have to tell you that at this point now, we're talking about November now, Dawn Steele and her rather fascistic regime had showed up, and David Picker was gone, and I looked around one day at a marketing meeting and about half the people were gone. And I knew that, you know, there were a lot of people there, and at one point, and then half of them weren't there, and you know, I knew that they were leaving, and the climate at that place turned from the utopian society that I discussed before into like HUAC and the blacklist, because there were people denouncing people. There were people saying, you know, Bingham Ray's a communist, aren't they? People were, you know, covering up. They were trying just to save their jobs and cover their ass, and they were professionals at that. And I'm just trying to do for the films. I'm just trying to work on these movies, and so it was getting increasingly difficult to do that. And at a marketing meeting where I wasn't invited but showed up anyway, they're around this table and Dawn Steele's in place and Jimmy's there, and so what happened was right before Christmas, I get a little assistant coming to see me, and she says, Jimmy wants to see you. I go in to see Jimmy. Jimmy fired me. And it was fine. It was bloodless. My wife and my son in the Honda, our only car, came to get me, and my little measly transfile box. And this is what I have to show from my Columbia experience. It's a picture my wife took of me on my stencil parking spot.